Hello, I'm Ashim Kumar, and this is Ukraine Brief Live from Warsaw. Today marks 1,581 days since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Here are the latest updates. 8 people have been killed in Russian strikes against Ukraine over the last day, including in missile attacks on populated civilian areas. In the city of Kryvyi Tuesday morning, 3 people were killed in a Russian ballistic missile attack that targeted an industrial enterprise, according to authorities. Over 24 were injured in the strike, with some still in critical condition. Trucks and a petrol station in Zaporizhzhia also came under attack, causing widespread fires. The driver of a trolley bus in the northern Sumy region is in critical condition after the vehicle was struck by Russian forces. 2 civilians were also wounded in the attack. Multiple homes were razed in the region overnight, with children as young as 14 injured by shrapnel. In other attacks against Ukraine, Russian strikes killed 5 people and wounded over 40. President Zelenskyy will not travel to this year's Ukraine Recovery Conference in Gdańsk, scheduled for Thursday, with Ukrainian Prime Minister Yulia Svyrydenko set to take his place. This comes amid a growing diplomatic row between the Polish and Ukrainian presidents.
I am leading Ukraine's delegation and our overall work at the Ukraine Recovery Conference 2026 in Gdańsk. The Ukrainian team includes representatives of Ukrainian businesses, heads of state-owned companies, leaders of communities from across the country, as well as government officials and members of parliament.
Ukrainian forces launched a wave of overnight attacks against energy infrastructure in Russian-occupied Crimea, forcing the closure of the Kerch Bridge for several hours. At least 2 oil reservoirs at the Kerch Power Plant were struck by Ukrainian drones, causing a massive fire and plumes of black smoke. Ukraine's strikes have exacerbated a fuel shortage and have caused blackouts on the peninsula. Multiple reports on Tuesday have suggested that up to half of Crimea lost power following Ukraine's most recent attack. This comes after the Russian-installed governor of Crimea on Monday announced an indefinite ban on the sale of gasoline to civilians. Ukrainian forces announced today that they had targeted another railway bridge in eastern Crimea, which Kyiv says is a key military transport corridor from Russia. Ukraine says that its patience is running out with the UN Security Council. The Ukrainian envoy to the UN warned that Kyiv may have to rethink its approach if the Council continues to delay its response to Russian aggression. Over the past 15 months, Ukraine has repeatedly called on the UN Security Council to adopt a resolution for a full and unconditional ceasefire, but to no avail.
Russians are feeling the dark breath of this war. Almost 40% of Russia's oil refineries have been damaged and no longer support its military campaign. Recent days have shown that even the air defense shield built around Moscow, reinforced by all the systems pulled from across Russia, is failing to protect its military targets. And that is just the beginning.
And now joining us is Peter Dickinson, a Ukraine alert editor at the Atlantic Council. Peter, welcome back to TP World. Thanks for taking the time.
Great to join you. Thanks for having me.
OK, so let's stay with Crimea for a second. It's been under the spotlight, the Ukrainian spotlight, in the sense that fuel supplies have been attacked, the fuel reservoir has been attacked, bridges have been attacked. The head of the Ukrainian drone defense forces said that Crimea is going to be very hot this summer. What do you read into this, into all of this activity?
Well, I think it's quite clear that the Ukrainians have identified Crimea as a weak link for the Russian invasion forces, that it is the area that is the most vulnerable to being cut off by the capabilities Ukraine now has. So we've seen in recent months, Ukraine's developed what they refer to as the mid-range drone strike capabilities. That's the ability to carry out large-scale bombing attacks using drones at a distance of around 30 to 200 or 300 kilometers behind the front lines. That puts Crimea in range. And Crimea, of course, is a peninsula, but it's almost an island. There's only a few connecting points to mainland Ukraine, and of course the Kerch Bridge. So I think the Ukrainians decided this is the most realistic option if they want to really have a big impact on the Russian forces and cut off their supplies. So this has been going on. This campaign's been running for months and months now. It's been very methodical. They've been taking out air defenses, then fuel supplies, then transport links, and so on. And they, I think now they would certainly call what we've seen in the last few days a major success. You know, the idea that the Crimean occupation authorities have actually come out and said no more fuel for the public indefinitely certainly is something that Kiev saw as a major success.
Well, and it's not just Ukraine, is it, Peter? I mean, fuel infrastructure across Russia is being attacked, so it's difficult to resupply Crimea with this fuel. What's the end goal? Is it to force the Russian military and civilians out of Crimea?
Certainly to force the Russian military out. I mean, the Russians have used Crimea as a launch pad for the invasion of Ukraine. So it's important in a practical sense. It's very important as a base for those Russian troops that are in, not only that are in Crimea itself, but who are in southern Ukraine. So by cutting off the supplies there in Crimea, they're effectively cutting off supplies that are coming through Crimea into the south of Ukraine. So it weakens Russia's military presence throughout all of southern Ukraine, including Crimea. So, of course, I think that's one of the key goals, is to force the Russians to weaken their position in southern Ukraine and to force them, ideally, yes, to withdraw, to recognise that the position in Crimea is untenable. There's also a psychological aspect here, because for Putin, very much personally, you know, Crimea is a symbol of it's seen as his greatest triumph. The seizure of Crimea in 2014 was where the invasion of Ukraine began. It's seen as Putin's greatest success, you know, the jewel in his crown, as it were, the feather in his cap, you know, his finest moment. And so by turning Crimea now into a major liability, they're also undermining Putin's personal prestige.
Right. Now, recently, Sergei Lavrov, Russian foreign minister, said that we are ready to resume them, referring to talks, at any time from the point where they left off. Now, not sure exactly what he means by that, but could this statement have been instigated by what's happening in Crimea simply to take the heat off the peninsula?
You're right. I mean, I think you're quite right there to say where did they leave off? At what point? Are we going back to 2014 now? Is it 2021? Hard to say. But yeah, I think certainly if you look at Russia's rhetoric until very recently, and then these comments we've had just in the last couple of days, you know, for a long time, Russia's been adamant they don't want to talk to Europe. They don't see any value in talking to Europe. They don't see any reason to talk to Europe. And I think they've actually been quite, not only have they rejected European overtures to begin talks, they've been quite insulting. They've been quite dismissive and said, you know, Europe has no role here. Europe is, you know, this is a matter for the big boys, essentially. This is the Americans and the Russians will decide between themselves. And now all of a sudden we're hearing from Lavrov and one of his deputies saying, well, you know, actually maybe we are ready to talk. So, I mean, I think this perhaps is a reflection of what's going on in Crimea and more broadly across the front. You know, we're seeing no Russian major, you know, no Russian advances, little Russian progress, and a lot of damage behind the lines from Ukrainian attacks. So maybe the Russians are feeling, yeah, maybe we do need to start some sort of talks. And as Trump is not delivering, maybe we do need to talk to Europe.
Right, OK. I want to move on to a soundbite that I want to share with you and the audience, and then I'll get your view on it.
And we must integrate European and Ukrainian military and industrial capabilities. It was difficult to understand if we in Europe would not take it as our vital interest to integrate the best European or even global military force of Ukraine into our European defense architecture.
Now, this was Andreas Kubilius, he's the EU defense minister, saying Russia's still going to be a threat to Europe. Do you think that's going to actually change anything in terms of the EU's response to or support of Ukraine?
I would say it already has. I mean, I think, if we look at Europe's current geopolitical predicament, they're faced with a Russia that, the opinions differ on whether Russia is an immediate threat to Europe or not, but I think few would argue that it is a long-term potential threat. Russia is clearly an expansionist power, and the limits of Putin's imperial ambitions, how far that expansionist ambition goes, it is really an open question. So, clearly Europe feels that there's a threat there. And at the same time, they're well aware that the Americans are sort of withdrawing away across the Atlantic. They don't want to be involved in European security anymore. So, as Europe looks at the situation, there are not that many serious militaries in Europe. I think, the Polish have been very big on spending. They have a strong military. The Finnish have maintained a strong military. The Brits are certainly on the list. But, beyond that, it really starts to look quite threadbare. And so if you're looking at a European security scenario now where you've got an expansionist Russia and an America in retreat, essentially, Ukraine becomes really an essential part of that European security architecture. So I think, that's already happening. And I think looking ahead, that's going to become a bigger and bigger issue for all Europeans. They're going to recognize that, it really makes sense to include Ukraine, and it's almost crazy not to, as it were. So that means support for Ukraine now and integration of Ukraine into the European security architecture.
Indeed. Peter, in the last few seconds that we have left, President Zelenskyy is not attending the Ukraine Recovery Conference being held this week in Gdańsk, Poland. Do you think this has anything to do with the spat between him and President Nawrocki over the loss of the Polish order that was awarded to President Zelenskyy?
Yeah, I think it's a direct consequence. I think there's no doubt about that. I mean, Zelenskyy would almost certainly have attended an event of that status. It's a major international event associated with Ukraine, so he would have been there. I would have assumed. But maybe maybe he's not sulking here. Maybe he's just looking to lower the tensions a little bit, to defuse the situation. I'm sure that there's going to be a lot of talk at this conference about getting relations back on track, getting back onto a more constructive narrative and working together. And perhaps Zelenskyy felt, my presence might not be particularly helpful at this particular time. I hope there'll become a time when he will be back there and Poland and Ukraine can get things back on track. But maybe at the moment he decided, it's best if I stay home.
Understood. Peter Dickinson, Ukraine Alert editor, thank you very much indeed for sharing your analysis with our audience, and have a good evening and stay safe.
Thank you.
And that brings us to the end of this episode of Ukraine Brief. Don't go away, lots more coming up. Goodbye.